Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. Tonight, we have a special guest on. His link will be in the description as well as his social media. And with that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares. So, my name is Vincent, and I used to be a paranormal investigator. I don't mean like the fake ones from TV shows and movies. I worked as an investigator for about 15 years. In that time, I encountered all kinds of strange beings. Most of the time, it was just some ghost who felt the need to screw around with some innocent person. Those were pretty easy to deal with. But there were the darker spirits. Ones that had a far more malevolent agenda at play. I have almost been burned alive, eaten, possessed, drowned in pig's blood, and a whole host of terrifying situations that are too numerous to discuss. But there was one case that I worked on which was far worse than all the rest. It was the case that made me quit. The case started, as most of them do, with a phone call to our agency. It was from a coal mining company out in the Appalachian Mountains. The caller was one of the managers of the mining operation, and he was explaining how many of the workers had noticed some strange things going on in and around the mine. He also said that they had unearthed some strange objects buried deep underground that he felt would be better to show us in person than to explain over the phone. I was assigned the case, as were two other investigators named Tommy and Linda. We flew out to the mine and began our investigation. The mine was located just outside of a small town deep in the mountains. The entrance to the mine was dug into the side of the mountain, and one could see its slow descent deep beneath the surface. There were a few portable buildings and heavy machinery spread out around the mine. Miners hung out around the areas, some doing work, others heading into the mines, and others drinking some beers. The head manager of the mine met us up front. He wore a gray jacket with the company logo on it, as well as some work boots and a hard hat with a light attached to it. He was also a rather fat man. He first brought us over to the edge of the forest to show us the strange occurrence. He pointed at the trees. All of the trees were dripping blood. I don't mean that the trees were covered in blood, but there sure as hell was a lot of it. There must have been about 50 trees. Each one of them was pouring blood into the ground below. There were puddles of it everywhere. Linda pulled out a few containers and we all started to take some samples of the blood from several different trees. We then went back to the mine and ran some tests on it. Turns out, each tree was dripping a different type of blood, which meant it came from several different sources. The DNA test confirmed it was from multiple different people. We went through the DNA database but found no matches. The manager then decided he ought to show us what they found in the mine. We walked through the mine's entrance. We were each given a hard hat with a light attached to it so we could see accurately. We walked down to the end of the tunnel where it sectioned off into multiple others. The manager led us down one, which led to a very rickety elevator. We all hopped in and we slowly made our descent. It took us about 20 minutes, going slow as hell, to finally reach our stop. We were told that we were about 500 feet beneath the surface on the lowest level of the mine. The air was cold on this level. They had no miners on this level of the mine. There were only a few dim lights illuminating the tunnels. The walls and ground were incredibly rugged and rocky. The manager led us down a confusing maze of caverns and tunnels. We would occasionally descend down some ladders. He gave each of us a map of the mine in case we got separated. We finally reached the spot he was leading us to. It was a hole carved into the rock wall by one of the miners. The hole led to a cavern on the other side. We stepped through the hole in the wall and turned on our headlamps. The cavern was shaped like a massive cylinder that went quite high up. The ground was somewhat wet. Upon closer investigation, we were shocked to find that we were not standing in water. We were standing in blood. A very thin layer of it covered the cavern floor, and we immediately took samples of it as well. Then we saw what the miners had actually found. It was some kind of shrine. It was one of the most disturbing things that I've ever seen. It was arranged with a large table in the middle. Each of the legs of the table had a marble snake wrapped around it, and resting on the table, we found about 10 skeletal remains of newborn children. Except the children clearly had numerous birth defects. One's head was too big for its body. Another had 2 normal arms and 1 tiny one stretched out of its chest. Another had growths protruding from several different locations on its skeleton. Behind the table there say another skeleton. It was pure black, almost like it had been burned. It was about 10 feet tall and was holding its skull in its hands, looking down at the children. Its skull looked like a human skull, albeit jet black and much bigger, except it had 4 horns protruding out of it. We approached the shrine and took several photographs of it from several different angles. I just couldn't understand it. First off, the cavern had been completely sealed shut when we had entered. The first ever entrance ever made into the cavern came from the miners. I then realized something. We took several DNA samples from the skeletons. We then returned to the surface. When we returned to the surface, we compared them with the DNA we had found in the blood on the trees. They matched perfectly. The blood had come from the children. I felt like I was going to be sick. This case was certainly one of the worst ones I have ever encountered. I informed the manager that they had to shut down the mine until we could figure out what the hell was going on. He refused, saying that stopping production now would cost the company a crap ton. Plus, the workers needed the money to feed their families. I told him that he was putting his workers in danger, but he refused to listen. Later on, we went back to the mine and continued the investigation, as I followed the walls of the cavern and felt for any irregularities. Tommy held an energy scanner in his hand, and it would start beeping whenever it encountered a strong energy source. When he hovered it over the shrine, it started beeping quite a fair bit. I went over to one of the walls, and I noticed something. It appeared to be a lot smoother than the rest of the cavern. Then I knocked on it. It was hollow. I brought Tommy and Linda over to it. Tommy's energy scanner went haywire when he hovered it over the wall, more so than for the shrine. It was beeping over and over again. I called the manager over and told him to get some miners to bust down this wall. They arrived a little while later with drills and explosives. They immediately started drilling it, and it didn't take long for the wall to collapse. We were left with a giant hole in the cave wall. It was a very dark tunnel, extending very far and was descending at a steep incline. Me, Tommy, and Linda descended into the tunnel. We walked for quite a ways down this tunnel. It just went on and on. The light from our helmets only extended a few feet in front of us. We eventually reached the end of the tunnel, and it opened up into a vast cavern filled with stalactites and stalagmites. I could hear running water in the distance, and Tommy's scanner was going nuts by this point. We maneuvered our way around the cavern. It varied quite considerably in terms of terrain. I pushed myself past a particularly large stalagmite, and when I looked back, I noticed something. Linda was gone. Like, she just vanished. Me and Tommy looked around wildly in all directions. We called out her name several times, but she didn't answer. We were about to retrace our steps when all of a sudden, we heard something out a ways in front of us. It was crying, uncontrollable sobbing. We pointed our helmets out to it, but it was too far into the cavern. We followed the source of the noise, and as we did, Tommy's scanner went completely nuts. We eventually found the source. It was 10 little children, each one with numerous different birth defects. They were all crying hysterically. They were chained against the wall of the cavern with giant padlocks. I immediately ran to them and tried to break the chains. They didn't even seem to notice I was there though. Then, something changed. A strange feeling of dread washed over me. I realized Tommy's scanner had stopped beeping. I looked back and he was gone. I looked all around me, and then I felt him before I saw him. A feeling I had never felt before and is very difficult to describe. It was like sadness. It towered over me. It was completely naked and lacked genitals. Its body was covered in scars and bumps and burns. Its face was the most scarred of all, and had 4 giant horns sticking out of it, 2 on its head and 2 beneath its mouth. And then I saw its eyes. What I saw was the misery of the human race. I saw people being murdered, tortured, starved, and abused. I saw millions enslaved by cruel masters. I saw millions march to their deaths at the hands of evil. I saw wars fought on a blackened earth, with the bodies of young men strewn about. I saw people dying of disease and sickness, spreading their last moments in painful agony. And then I saw these children, sold to this cruel being because their parents did not want them. They abandoned them, and he found them, and now they were his. I woke up several days later in the middle of the forest. I had been sent several miles away from the mine. I later found Tommy and Linda. They both told me they were sent off in a similar way that I had, although they didn't experience what I experienced. The manager of the mine told me the cavern had collapsed, and after extensive digging, they were unable to find any evidence of the shrine or anything we had witnessed. They continued mining operations and did not encounter any other strange phenomenon. As for me, I tried to go back to my job. I really did. I ran a few more cases, but I would have panic attacks on the job and random flashbacks to what he showed me. Eventually, I decided it would be in everyone's best interest if I just quit. I currently work as a taxi driver. I know, quite the career change. But it pays well enough, and I enjoy it well enough. But when I close my eyes at night, or when I'm daydreaming out of boredom, I see those images, I see those children, and I see him.
I first heard this story when I was in college. I had come home for winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunters program on TV, just for the laughs. I don't really believe in that stuff. When you watch the programs on TV, they're just so obviously fake. It's too hard for me to let go of my preconceptions and just watch and try to get into it. My dad was the same way, so I thought. He didn't seem interested in the paranormal or anything. He was just the kind of guy that would scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial, and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Sort of out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" "Yup." His reply was so casual it shocked me. "Really?" I asked, a bit taken aback. "Like, it just doesn't really seem like you." He shrugged his shoulders and mulled me over what I just said. "Yeah," he eventually replied. "I know ghosts are real. I've met one." Upon hearing his statement, I had to know the story. You see, my dad is just like me. He likes to tell stories. I could retell some of the stories from my memory, just because he would tell them so frequently, to anyone who would listen. Yet here was a story I had never heard before. An event that changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't know if I believe it or not, but when someone is so influential in your life, someone who seems logical and so down to earth tells you something like this, it calls into question what you really do believe, and why. And though he never brings it up when I talk to him about it, he swears it's completely true. No exaggeration, and no doubt in his mind about what happened. Here it is, told from his point of view. It was back in the house in Tacoma, where you grew up, until you were about 4 years old. My parents still lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for the weekend. I was just over at Tacoma Community College, so I wasn't far away. I came back often to visit, and get home-cooked meals. I remember that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just the three of us. It was in the late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't really gotten dark yet. We were talking like normal when the phone rang in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and I in the other room together alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. I remember she seemed worried. Her voice was shaking a bit. My dad wiped his face and got up, and joined my mother in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were talking quietly, and it felt strange. After a few more moments, they came out of the kitchen. They had on their coats now. "Something's come up, we have to go for a bit," my mother said. "There's dessert in the fridge, help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes, I'll wash them when we get back." My dad said nothing, but I could tell from his face it was serious. My mom looked genuinely worried. They were out of the door in a flash, and I was left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table and washed my plate, despite my mom's instructions. Then I went into the main room to read. I sat on the sofa, and I opened up one of my school books and began to relax. Hours went by, and my parents still hadn't come back. It was around 11 o'clock, and I was just about to get ready for bed. I walked upstairs, making my way to the bathroom, when I heard a strange noise. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out whining noise. The wood was creaking gently. It wasn't an unusual sound, but there was an unusual rhythm to it that made me uncomfortable and curious. After listening a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, along with a metallic creaking noise. I gathered up my courage and decided to investigate. I climbed the steps. Now, I have to say, I wasn't scared. I didn't have an uneasy feeling. Actually, to the contrary, I felt quite comfortable. Even though it was dark and eerie, the energy in the room wasn't foreboding. It felt almost warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it quickly became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage was an old rocking chair, one that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of the many possessions she had left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly and couldn't fit much of her belongings in there. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboards to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, an old bird cage was displaying a similar behavior. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet, metallic creak. I figured there was a draft, and knowing that the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it, I set out in search of the source. I combed the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows, and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside. It was a calm evening. And furthermore, the chair was heavy, as was the birdcage. Yet there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed, stacks of paper and the like. After a while, I gave up and looked back at the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my hand on the armrest, and the chair stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any type of draft. I lifted my hand and the chair was calm and quiet, but as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back and the chair was still rocking. That was really strange. But as I said before, I wasn't really creeped out. I shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was still slowly swinging open and close. The cage had once housed a parrot belonging to my grandmother, but it had been empty for some time. I latched the cage shut, figuring that I could at least stop this one sound. I made for the steps, but just as I was about halfway down, I heard the metal creaking again. I looked behind me, and the cage door was back to it, swinging open, unlatched, right alongside the chair which continued rocking as before. Something had caused it to unlatch. I was sure I had latched it properly. In any other circumstance, I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason, I wasn't. I just didn't feel uneasy. A rocking chair and a birdcage really aren't harbingers of doom anyway. I descended from the attic with one last glance at the strange behavior and went about my bedtime routine. The creaking continued for a while, and I couldn't sleep through it. I went back downstairs to where I couldn't hear the noise and continued reading. It was a little after midnight, and I heard my parents pull into the driveway finally. They came in and found me reading, and they sat down with me. My mom was crying. They explained to me that they had spent the evening at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away. That's the story as my dad tells it. He believes to this day that, before she left this world, his grandmother came home to pay one last visit.
Have you ever wanted to explore somewhere haunted? It's seemingly become a fad ever since the rise of ghost hunting shows. Now, there are even locations that advertise themselves as being haunted in hopes of drawing in a certain crowd. When I found out that they were giving out haunted tours in an old school only a few hours from me, I laughed it off at first. It seemed like an obvious ploy for money. I did research on the school and there were no child deaths, nor any disappearances in the area since the founding of the school. The tour even advertised that it was linked to Indian burial grounds, of course, with just a little research that was proven false as well, however. When I brought up the topic as a joke to my friend Ethan, I didn't realize that he was an avid fan of those ghost hunting shows. I realized my mistake immediately when instead of laughing with me, instead, his eyes lit up in excitement. "We have to go check it out," Ethan said immediately. "Why? It's obviously a scam. It would be just a waste of money," I replied. "What if I pay for everything? Gas, food, and the way in? Don't make me go alone." "Fine, but I'm holding you to that." I only agreed because I didn't really have anything better to do. And if he was paying, then at least I wouldn't feel as if I was wasting my money. Perhaps I could get a good laugh or two out of it all. The tour was only held on weekends at night. The cost was $100 per person. Quite a steep price just to walk around a school for a few hours, but it wasn't my money. We got there a little early and met up with the rest of the tour group. There were about 15 people in total, including us. Whoever was running this operation was a genius. They began the tour by telling us some backstory. They immediately brought up the Indian burial grounds, and then talked about how a younger girl had died from a seizure at the school long ago. Of course, I already knew both of these were lies, but that didn't stop the rest of the crowd from gasping. The first room they let us into was pretty normal, just an old classroom. The guide began telling more backstory, but I had mostly zoomed out at this point. That was until I began to hear a loud scratching noise. Admittedly, this did catch my attention at first. That was until I looked at the guide quickly moving their hands away from one of their back pockets. There must have been some sort of button to trigger the noise. No one else seemed to notice this though, as they were all distracted trying to find where the noise came from. I had to contain myself from bursting out in laughter when entering the second room. The guide warned us that it was probably the scariest room in the school, but it was not what I expected at all. There was the graffiti all over the walls reading "Help," "Run," "Die," and so on. It was so over-exaggerated that, at this point, even a few of the other people on the tour mocked it. Yet, it still wasn't enough to wake up the majority of the group. Somehow, they were all still buying this, and of course, Ethan was one of them. I had had enough though, and I told him I was going to wait outside, but if he wanted to keep going, that was fine. He attempted to convince me to stay on the tour, but I had had my fill of ghost hunting, and I needed fresh air. I slipped away from the group as they continued onward and went back outside. I intended on going back to my car, but seeing a playground out of the corner of my eye gave me a sudden urge to relive a bit of my childhood. I sat firmly on the old swing set before pulling out my phone to browse the internet. "You need to go back inside," a voice said in front of me. It was dark outside, but I hadn't seen any figures approach me. I guess I had been too distracted by my phone. Why? "What are you, security?" I replied before looking up from my phone. After looking up, I realized this probably wasn't a security guard. She looked like a 13 to 14-year-old girl. "No, but your friend is in danger," she said matter-of-factly. "What are you saying? How would you even know that?" "This tour isn't what you think it is. You need to get your friend and leave." "Oh, and what are you, a ghost that haunts this place?" "I didn't used to be, but I am now. This place didn't used to be haunted, but they bring people here to turn them into ghosts. You and your friend are both in danger. Some of the other people on the tour aren't really here for the guide." "That's an interesting theory, but you're wrong." "What?" the girl said as she looked at me in confusion. "Perhaps making real ghosts here is a side effect, but that's not their intentions. Do you understand how much human organs go for on the black market? I had some debts that needed to be paid, and it seems whoever brought you here must have been in the same situation. I wasn't entirely convinced she was a ghost at first, but I didn't mind telling her the truth because I knew she couldn't outrun me, and perhaps I could have gotten a second check. It was quite amazing how she disappeared in a blink of an eye. I wasn't sure if I even believed in ghosts before, but this certainly made things more interesting. I had never really cared about Ethan much, and I had made certain that no one else knew we were coming to this guide together. I continued to wait at the swing set until I received a text message to come collect my payment. I had needed the money bad, and the whole situation just worked out perfectly. I wondered who else on the guide tonight would be going home, but it didn't matter too much to me. Perhaps there is some validity to ghost hunting after all, and perhaps Ethan will be a permanent part of the tour.
Time and time again, my mother told me this story. One evening, while Mom lied in bed facing the wall, she always locked the door to her room, being there in the dark by herself. She would be half asleep and half awake at the same time when she felt an ominous weight at the edge of her bed. She was chilled with fear, as she knew no one could possibly be in the room with her. She said she felt a motherly presence that was watching her as she slept. Mom wouldn't even dare to turn her head to look at this, whatever it was, that sat beside her on the bed. She was too scared to look at it, because she thought she would die of fear if she saw what it was. She spent the whole night praying that it would go away and leave her alone. That was one of the many incidents that happened in her house. There was a second mysterious situation where my mom would hear knocks as if there was someone in the house with her. Mom would run to the door, excited when she heard the knocks at first, but no one would be there. She says it would happen at random, 2 or 3 times in the day alone. She thought that it was someone pulling a prank, but it dawned on her that she had no neighbors for miles around. That's when she became scared. Eventually it stopped, but it did stay with her. Mom was becoming increasingly more frightened, because nothing would add up. She said that she remembered when the door knock stopped, there would be soft tappings between the walls. In the beginning, she thought that she was hearing things, and she didn't pay any mind to it, but she constantly kept hearing soft taps from inside the house, day or night. Mom didn't want to tell anybody, because they would probably discount her and tell her that it was probably her imagination working in overdrive. Her mind was slowly becoming fearful to what it could be. So one night, when my grandparents left to go food shopping in another town, my mom decided to stay by herself because she thought it was boring, but she completely forgot about all the things that happened to her in that house. Mom was sitting in the living room because they had left early and she was thinking that they would come home before dark. She was there in the living room all alone while it was completely pitch dark outside. All she heard was frogs croaking by the lake and crickets peacefully chirping the night away. Mom was getting a feeling that she was being watched through the windows, even though the windows were way too high for someone to look through. She was running around the house like a headless chicken full of panic and fright, for her bad decision that she regrets to this day of staying all alone. And like if it could get any worse for my poor mother, the tappings came back, but louder. Mom thought she must have been going crazy, or that fear was grabbing a hold of her, so she decided to confront whatever it was that she thought was doing it. She started to follow the noise where the tappings were coming from. It was towards the very back end of the house, near the back door. As she inched closer and closer, she put her ear against an inner wall of a small dark closet near the back door, where the knocks were coming from, and what she told me next gave me goosebumps. She said that she heard the wailing cry of a baby infant, bawling and crying as if it were trapped inside the closet. My mom didn't even bother to check because it shook her up. Then, out of the blue, the tappings inside the house came back, but much, much louder than before. She ran into her room and locked the door when she went to go get her rosary. Mom waited for what she felt like was an eternity for her family to come home. After that, she never thought about staying alone again. After Mom was done hearing things, now she said she finally saw it for the first time. Yet another dark night, in the middle of summer, Mom and her siblings were eagerly waiting for her dad to come home from work. She ran into the back door, anticipating his arrival. Mom opened the door without hesitation, and she went silent and numb of what she had seen. At a distance, from what my mother could see, was a solid white entity or soul-shaped woman floating ever so gently across the backyard, going from one corner of the old barn to the other corner that was demolished right after my mom had moved in. It was knocked down because my grandparents were concerned that the old dilapidated shed would cave in while Mom was playing in there with her brothers and sisters. When that ghostly woman reached the shed, she disappeared into thin air. Mom was speechless of what she saw and ran back into her house to my grandmother. She couldn't even speak, and after a while, when the fright left her, she told my grandmother of what it was. My grandmother told my mom something chilling. She presumed that that woman was trying to communicate with my mother. Mom said she didn't want to have anything to do with that woman. My grandmother said that if Mom didn't call out to her, the woman wouldn't try to stop communicating with her. It's odd because it just happened to her and not her siblings. My grandmother mentioned to my mother to ask it what it wants. My mother complied, and when she did that, the woman never responded to her, and all the paranormal things stopped. Now that my mom told me this, she recalled that my aunt researched about the house's history and freakishly found out that there were 5 children that lived in the house, just like my mom's family of 5. Disturbingly, one of the children was killed by a stray gunshot of a bullet in the house that was built in the 1920s, but the barn and shed were built during the gold rush of California. I suppose that the woman thought that my mom was the child who died in the house and wanted to communicate with her to see if that was her child. Mom told me that this would be the first and last time she'd ever tell this, as she mentally felt scarred by this. I will never forget what my mom had endured, but every time that she has actually told me this story, it has chilled me to my very core.
Thanks for watching, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your story, my email and subreddit will be in the description below. And also, if you're not subscribed, please do if you want. And don't forget to like and comment as well. Have beautiful nightmares. And I will see you next time.